Sarah Thompson always prided herself on her rationality. At 35, she had built a solid career as a university physics professor in Boston, dedicating her life to science and logical thinking. Her apartment in the Back Bay neighborhood, though small, perfectly reflected her personality, organized, practical, and with no room for frivolities. The white walls were decorated only with diplomas and certifications, silent witnesses to a life dedicated to empirical knowledge. That September morning, as she prepared her breakfast, her thoughts wandered to the lecture she would give on quantum mechanics. The sound of the electric kettle mingled with the distant noise of Boston traffic, creating a familiar urban symphony. Sarah noticed that the kitchen light had been flickering for days, another item on her mental list of small household repairs that needed to be addressed. "I'll change that bulb today," she muttered to herself, sipping her black coffee without sugar. It was typical of her to solve problems immediately, without relying on anyone. This independence had deep roots, cultivated since she was 12 when her father abandoned the family without explanation. Her cell phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from her mother, Karen. "Honey, did you see that the spiritual center near home is hosting lectures on near-death experiences? It might be interesting for you to check out." Sarah rolled her eyes, deleting the message without responding. Since her mother had started attending the spiritual center 3 years ago, her attempts to bring her daughter closer to spirituality had become more frequent. For Sarah, it was frustrating to see such an intelligent woman as her mother surrendering to what she considered superstitions. Near-death experiences are just hallucinations caused by lack of oxygen in the brain, she muttered to herself, repeating what she used to say in her classes when a student dared to question the limits between science and spirituality. Finished. With her coffee, Sarah prepared to change the light bulb. She climbed onto a kitchen chair, one of those folding metal ones that seemed stable enough. As she unscrewed the burnt-out bulb, her thoughts wandered to the last argument she had with her mother on the subject. "Mom, you're an educated woman with a law degree. How can you believe in these things?" she had questioned, with that tone of superiority she reserved for academic debates. Karen had just smiled, with that serenity that Sarah found irritating. "Honey, there are truths that science still can't explain. The universe is bigger than our microscopes can see." The memory of the conversation distracted her for a moment. It was enough for her foot to slip on the unstable chair. Sarah felt the world spin in slow motion. Her arms flailed in the air, uselessly seeking something to hold on to. The last thing she registered was the sound of the light bulb shattering. On the floor, followed by a dull impact, the world went dark. When her eyes opened again, Sarah experienced a strange sense of displacement. She was looking at her own body lying on the kitchen floor, a pool of blood forming near her head. The scene seemed surreal, as if she were watching a movie in third person. "This can't be happening," she thought, observing herself from above. "It's just a hallucination caused by the concussion. Soon my brain will reorganize the neurological signals," and her thoughts were interrupted by distant voices. It was her neighbors, probably alerted by the noise of the fall. The apartment door was broken down, and Sarah saw when Mrs. Jenkins, the neighbor from 502, came running into the kitchen, followed by other residents of the building. "Oh my God, Professor Sarah!" shouted Mrs. Jenkins, already with her cell, phone in hand, dialing emergency services. "She's bleeding a lot." Sarah tried to say she was fine, that it was just a small accident, but realized her voice wasn't producing any sound. She tried to touch Mrs. Jenkins's shoulder, but her hand passed through the neighbor's body as if it were made of smoke. Panic began to set in. For the first time in her life, Sarah was facing something her Cartesian logic couldn't explain. She watched, helpless, as the paramedics arrived, performing first aid and placing her on the stretcher. During the journey to the hospital, Sarah floated above her own unconscious form in the ambulance, hearing the paramedics discuss her condition. "Pressure dropping, intracranial hemorrhage. We need to stabilize her." Medical terms that in her scientific mind had always been objective and clear now seemed distant and frightening. In the emergency room of Massachusetts General Hospital, the medical team worked frantically on her body. Sarah observed everything from a corner of the emergency room, feeling increasingly distant from the reality she knew. The machines began to beep alarmingly, and she heard clearly when the doctor announced, "Cardiac arrest, start resuscitation protocol." It was at this moment that Sarah felt an irresistible force pulling her away from the emergency room, from the medical team, from her body, and from everything she knew. The last thing she saw was the clock on the wall, marking 9:47 a.m., before being engulfed by absolute darkness. The darkness that enveloped Sarah was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. It wasn't just the absence of light, but a palpable density that seemed to press on every part of her consciousness. The silence was deafening, so profound, that she could hear the echo of her own thoughts. "This isn't real," she tried to convince herself, desperately seeking a scientific explanation for what she was experiencing. "Has just my brain processing the trauma of the accident? Random synapses creating patterns that seem to have meaning." But the more she tried to rationalize, the more the darkness seemed to mock her certainties. The void began to move around, her like a living, pulsating entity. It was then that the first whispers began, so low that they initially seemed like mere imagination. "Sarah." The whispers multiplied, coming from all directions. "Sarah Thompson." She tried to concentrate, to determine the origin of the sounds, but it was impossible. It was as if the voices emanated from the darkness itself. Gradually the whispers became clearer, more distinct, until they transformed into recognizable voices. "Why do you always hide behind books, Sarah?" It was the voice of her first boyfriend, Peter, from college days. "Why can't you surrender to what you feel?" "Honey, why have you built this wall around yourself?" Her mother's voice echoed, laden with sadness. "Why don't you allow anyone to truly get close?" The voices overlapped, each bringing to the surface memories that Sarah had tried to bury. Moments of chosen solitude, relationships abandoned before they could deepen, friendships kept at a safe distance. In the darkness, shapes began to materialize. They were like shadows, denser than the darkness itself, silhouettes that moved and transformed. Sarah recognized scenes from her life, moments when her rationality had served as a shield against emotional vulnerability. A particularly painful scene took shape. She, at 12 years old, sitting on the stairs at home, waiting for a father who would never return. The girl in the memory held a math book, using it as a distraction to avoid crying. It was on that day that Sarah decided emotions were dangerous, that logic and reason were the only reliable foundations. "You remember that day, don't you?" Deep, familiar male voice cut through the others. Sarah felt her imaginary heart tighten. It was her father's voice. "No." She tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to run in the darkness. "You're not real. None of this is real." "You've built your entire life running away from me," her father's voice continued, "running from what my departure represented. But in doing so, you also ran away from yourself." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Memories she had suppressed for decades began to emerge, moments of loneliness disguised as independence, relationships sabotaged before they could hurt her, an entire life built on the foundation of fear of abandonment. "Stop!" she shouted into the void. "This is just a construction of my mind. Faulty synapses due to lack of oxygen. It's not real." But the voices continued, relentless. Now they were her students, questioning why she was so inflexible in her convictions. They were her fellow professors, commenting on her professional coldness. It was her mother, asking why she never accepted a hug without tensing up. The silhouettes around her began to spin faster, forming a whirlwind of memories and regrets. Sarah saw all the times she chose solitude out of fear of rejection, all the opportunities for connection she wasted out of fear of getting hurt. "You built your fortress of knowledge," the voices now spoke in unison, "but you forgot to build bridges." Despair began to take hold of Sarah. For the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to feel completely vulnerable. There were no equations to solve this, no scientific theories to explain the pain she felt. "Help!" she shouted into the void. "Someone, please!" It was in this moment of complete surrender that something changed. In the midst of the oppressive darkness, a point of light began to shine. It was tiny at first, no larger than a distant star, but its presence completely altered the atmosphere around Sarah. The accusing voices began to diminish, and the torturing silhouettes lost their intensity. The light, still small but growing, seemed to promise something different. Something Sarah hadn't experienced since childhood: hope. The luminous point grew gradually, like a dawn in fast forward. As it expanded, the light not only illuminated the space around, but seemed to emanate a quality that Sarah had never experienced before: an unconditional and absolutely pure love. The scientist in Sarah tried to categorize the sensation, to seek parallels with known phenomena, but it was useless. That light transcended any rational explanation. It wasn't just visual, it was a presence that touched every part of her being, filling empty spaces she didn't even know existed. "Welcome, Sarah," a voice emanated from the light. It wasn't a sound in the conventional sense, but a vibration that resonated in her very essence. The voice had no defined gender. It was simultaneously familiar and completely new. Who are you?" Sarah asked, surprised to realize that her voice now worked. "I am," responded the presence with a simplicity that carried universes of meaning. "And you are too, Sarah. You always have been, even when you tried to convince yourself otherwise." The light approached, enveloping her in an ethereal embrace. Sarah felt tears forming in her consciousness, not physical tears, but the pure essence of emotion. It was as if every cell of her being was being bathed in understanding and acceptance. "How you have carried so much weight," the presence continued. "Shall we look at your journey together?" Before Sarah could respond, the space around her transformed. It was like being inside a three-dimensional movie of her own memories, but now seen from a completely new perspective. She saw herself as a child, playing in the backyard of her home. But this time she could feel the purity of her childlike joy, the natural ability to marvel at the world. She saw the exact moment when she began to build her first emotional barriers, like small bricks of protection. "Observe carefully," the presence guided, as the scene changed to the day of her father's departure. Sarah saw herself at 12 years old, but now she could also see her father at the moment of his decision to leave. For the first time, she saw not only her own pain, but also his torment, a man broken by his own insecurities, trapped in a cycle of self-destruction that came from generations. "So he was lost too," the presence explained gently. "Like you, he built his own prisons." The scenes continued to flow, her adolescence focused exclusively on studies, her first academic achievements, each moment of professional success. But now, Sarah could see what she had lost in the process: genuine connections, moments of vulnerability that could have led to deep relationships, opportunities for emotional growth. "You transformed your fear into an intellectual fortress," the presence continued. "Each degree, each academic achievement became another brick in your walls of protection." Sarah observed her academic life unfold, the nights studying alone, the flawless presentations, the award-winning publications. But now she could see the faces of people who had tried to get close: colleagues, students, suitors, all kept at a safe distance by her armor of rationality. "But look closer," the presence guided her. "See what happened in the moments when you lowered your guard." The scenes changed to moments Sarah had almost forgotten: consoling a student who had lost her mother, helping a fellow professor during an anxiety crisis, taking care of her mother when she fell ill. In each of these moments, her true essence shone through the cracks in her armor. You never lost your capacity to love, Sarah. You just hid it so well that even you forgot where you had put it. The light grew in intensity, and Sarah felt a wave of understanding pass through her. All her life she had confused protection with prison, independence with isolation. Her relentless pursuit of knowledge was not just a thirst for learning, but a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. "And your father?" the presence asked gently. "Are you ready to see him as he really is?" A new scene materialized around Sarah. It was a small apartment somewhere in Boston, modest and a bit untidy. In the center of the living room, sitting in a worn armchair, was her father, John. He looked much older than she remembered, with completely white hair and shoulders curved by the weight of years. Sarah watched, astonished, as her father leafed through an old photo album. His hands trembled slightly as he turned each page, and silent tears ran down his wrinkled face. "He does this every night," the presence explained. "He relives every moment he lost, every choice that took him away from you." Sarah saw her father stop at a specific photo, her at 12 years old, smiling with a science fair trophy. The photo had been taken weeks before he left. John touched the image with trembling fingers. "My little scientist," he murmured into the emptiness of the apartment. "Will you ever be able to forgive me?" The scene changed, showing different moments of her father's life after his departure. Sarah saw his failed attempts to rebuild his life, the lost jobs, the ruined relationships. She saw how he always carried her photo in his wallet, how he tried several times to write letters that he never sent. "He never forgave himself," the presence continued, "just as you never allowed yourself to fully feel." Sarah felt something break inside her. Years of pent-up resentment, of controlled anger began to dissolve in the face of the vision of her father's broken humanity. He wasn't the monster she had built in her mind, nor the hero she had once adored. He was just a man, as lost and scared as she was herself. "Why are you showing me this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with long-suppressed emotions. "Because forgiveness isn't just a gift you give to others, Sarah. It's a liberation you grant yourself." The light enveloped Sarah again, this time bringing with it a sensation of deep understanding. She saw how her resentment had become an anchor, keeping her tied to the past, preventing her from fully living in the present. "But how?" Sarah questioned. "How can I forgive something that changed my entire life?" "Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past," the presence responded. "It's about choosing not to let it control your future." At that moment, Sarah felt a connection that transcended time and space. She could feel her father's pain as if it were her own, understand his fears and regrets. It was an experience of empathy so profound that it surpassed any rational understanding. "Now," said the presence, "you are ready to make a choice." The space around Sarah transformed once again. Now she found herself in a place that seemed to exist between dimensions, neither light nor darkness, but a state of infinite possibilities. In front of her, 2 doors materialized. "Each choice we make shapes not only our future but also redefines our past," the presence explained. "You are at a decisive moment, Sarah." The first door emanated a familiar, comforting light. Through it, Sarah could glimpse her life as it was, structured, predictable, safe. Her academic career, her organized apartment, her carefully planned routines. The second door shone with a different light, more intense and a bit frightening. Through it, Sarah perceived possibilities she had never considered before: vulnerability, connection, emotional growth. "There is no wrong choice," the presence assured, "but each path leads to a different version of yourself." Sarah approached the first door, feeling its familiar call. It would be easy to return to her previous life, continue being the respected and distant professor, the rational scientist who had answers for everything except her own heart. "What if I choose to go back as before?" she asked. "Then this experience will become just a distant dream, a memory that will slowly dissipate," the presence responded. "You will continue your life, perhaps a little wiser, but essentially the same." Sarah turned to the second door, feeling its magnetic power. Through it, she could feel the weight of all the emotions she had repressed over the years, but also the promise of a freedom she had never known. "And if I choose to change, then you will have to face everything you have always avoided. You will have to learn to live without your armor, to trust without guarantees, to love without fear." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. Her entire life had been built on the foundation of certainty, control, predictability. The idea of abandoning this was terrifying. But then she remembered the vision of her father, aged and regretful, trapped in his own cage of remorse. She remembered all the times her mother had tried to reach her through the barriers she had built. She thought of all the moments of genuine connection she had sacrificed on the altar of self-preservation. "How can I be sure I'm making the right choice?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The presence responded with a gentleness that touched the depths of her soul. "The certainty you seek doesn't exist, Sarah. That's the beauty and terror of life. We can't control the outcome, only our willingness to surrender to the process. Sarah took a step towards the second door, feeling her heart race. For the first time in her adult life, she was about to make a choice based not on logic but on faith. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Fear is natural," the presence replied. "It only becomes a prison when we allow it to paralyze us." With one last look at the door of safety, Sarah took a deep breath and crossed the threshold of transformation. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt an explosion of sensations coursing through her being. It was as if every cell of her existence was being recalibrated, adjusted to a new frequency of life. "You have chosen the path of growth," the presence said, its voice now merging with the light that enveloped Sarah. "But remember, the true journey is only beginning." The first sound Sarah heard was the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the fluorescent light of the hospital room. The first person she saw was her mother, Regina, sitting beside her bed, holding her hand and praying softly. Mom. Her voice came out hoarse, as if unused. "For days." Regina looked up, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Sarah, thank God. Honey, you gave us a terrible scare." Sarah tried to move, but her body felt too heavy. Her head was throbbing, and there was a confusion of memories mixing in her mind. The accident, the darkness, the light, the revelations. Everything seemed simultaneously distant and intensely present. How long?" she asked, her throat dry. "You were in a coma for 3 days, honey," Regina explained, offering water with a spoon. "But the doctors said the most critical period was the first 8 minutes when your heart stopped. They almost lost you." 8 minutes. An eternity compressed into 480 seconds. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of this information. Each second of those 8 minutes had fundamentally altered who she was. "Mom," Sarah called, her voice firmer now. "Forgive me for all the times I mocked your faith, for all the times I pushed you away." Regina squeezed her hand, surprised by the change in her daughter's tone. "It's all right, my love, you're here now, that's what matters." In the days that followed, as she recovered in the hospital, Sarah began to process everything she had experienced. The doctors talked about cranial trauma, possible neurological sequelae, but she knew that the true transformation had occurred on a level that no medical examination could detect. Her hospital room became a point of reflection. Through the window she could see the movement of the city, people rushing about their lives, unaware of the fragility of existence. Each sunrise had a new meaning. Each visit from the nursing staff was an opportunity for human connection that she no longer wasted. On a particularly clear morning, as she watched the sun rise over the buildings of New York, Sarah made a decision. She picked up her phone and, with trembling fingers, typed a message to her mother. "I need help finding Dad." Regina arrived at the hospital that afternoon with a mixed expression of surprise and concern. "Are you sure about this, honey? You're still recovering." "I've never been so sure of anything in my life, Mom," Sarah replied, her voice calm but determined. "I need to do this, for him and for me." Her mother hesitated for a moment before reaching into her purse and pulling out a folded piece of paper. I always knew where he was," she admitted. "He called me a few years ago, wanting to know about you, but I respected your wish not to have contact." Sarah took the paper with slightly trembling hands. On it, an address in Brooklyn and a phone number. The reality of what she was about to do hit her with full force. "You don't have to do this now," Regina said softly. "You can wait until—" "You're stronger," Sarah shook her head. "No, Mom, I've waited too long. We've all waited too long." The taxi stopped in front of an old building in Brooklyn, its peeling facade telling stories of decades of urban life. Sarah, still using a cane for support due to her recovery, felt her heart race as she recognized the address. "Want me to wait, ma'am?" asked the taxi driver, noticing her hesitation. "No, thank you," she replied, paying the fare. "Some journeys we need to make alone." The elevator was broken, forcing her to slowly climb 4 flights of stairs. Each step was an exercise not only physical, but emotional. When she finally reached apartment 42, she needed to pause a moment to catch her breath, both from the climb and from the anxiety of the moment. Her knocks on the door sounded strange to her own ears. For a moment there was only silence, then slow steps approached from the other side. The door opened, and Sarah found herself face to face with her father. Anthony looked exactly as he had in her vision during the near-death experience. White hair, hunched shoulders, eyes carrying the weight of decades of regret. For a moment neither of them could speak. "Sarah?" His voice was barely a whisper, as if he feared speaking louder might make the image of his daughter disappear. "Hi, Dad," she replied, surprised by the calmness in her own voice. Anthony took a step back, mechanically gesturing for her to enter. The apartment was exactly as she had seen in her experience. Small, modest, with worn but clean furniture. On the wall she immediately noticed a photo of her graduation, cut out from a newspaper. I followed your career," he said, following her gaze. "Through newspapers, internet, you became a brilliant scientist." Sarah observed the environment, noticing other framed newspaper clippings, reports about her research, an article about a lecture she had given, even a small text about when she won the university's Teacher of the Year award. "You kept all of this?" she asked, her voice choked. "Every achievement of yours," he replied, sitting heavily in his worn armchair. "It was the closest I could get to you." Sarah approached a side table where the same photo album she had seen in her vision was. With trembling hands, she opened it to the page she knew she would find, her at 12 years old, smiling with her science fair trophy. "You look at these photos every night," she said softly. Anthony looked at her, surprised. "How do you—" "It's a long story, Dad. A story about death and life, about forgiveness and transformation." Sitting in the chair across from him, Sarah began to tell her experience. She talked about the accident, the 8 minutes in the beyond, the revelations she had. As she spoke, she watched the emotions cross her father's face. Surprise, pain, hope. "I saw you, Dad. I saw your pain, your regret. I saw how you never really abandoned us here." She touched her own heart, "even though you left physically." Silent tears streamed down Anthony's wrinkled face. "I was a broken man, Sarah. I had so many inner demons, so many fears. I thought you'd be better off without me. It was the biggest mistake of my life." The months that followed the reunion with her father were of profound transformation for Sarah. Back to her activities at the university, she noticed how every aspect of her life had subtly changed, as if she was seeing the world through a new lens. In her first class after returning, her students immediately noticed the difference. The strict and distant professor had given way to someone who still maintained academic rigor, but now tempered with a humanity that was previously absent. "Today we're going to talk about the limits of science," she began the class, surprising everyone, about the frontiers where our rational understanding meets the inexplicable. In the packed lecture hall, Sarah could see expressions of surprise on her students' faces. Many of them knew her old inflexible stance on anything that couldn't be empirically proven. "Physics teaches us about the fundamental laws of the universe," she continued, "but it also shows us that there are phenomena that defy our current understanding. Quantum mechanics, for example, presents us with realities that seem to contradict our everyday logic." A student timidly raised his hand. "Professor, does this have to do with your accident? We heard you had a near-death experience." In other times, Sarah would have dismissed the question as irrelevant. Now she smiled softly. "Yes, Michael, and that experience taught me that sometimes the greatest discoveries happen when we're willing to question our own certainties." Her new perspectives were not limited to the classroom. At home, Sarah began to transform her apartment, previously a temple to rationality, into a more welcoming space. The diplomas on the walls gained the company of family photographs, including a recent one with her father. The deepest changes, however, were happening in her relationships. Every Sunday now, she had lunch with her parents, yes, both of them. The first meetings were tense. Decades of hurt don't dissolve overnight. But slowly a new family dynamic began to form. "I never thought we'd see this happen," Regina commented during one of these lunches, watching Sarah and Anthony talking about a research project. In her work, Sarah began to explore new areas of study. In addition to her physics research, she started an interdisciplinary project investigating the intersections between science and spirituality. Her more traditional colleagues criticized the new direction, but she had learned not to fear others' judgment. "True science doesn't fear difficult questions," she replied when questioned in a department meeting. "On the contrary, it embraces them." One afternoon, while organizing her notes for new research, Sarah received an unexpected visit in her office. It was Peter, her ex-boyfriend from college. "I heard about the changes in your work," he said after initial greetings. "I never imagined you'd be interested in these topics." Sarah smiled, recognizing the skepticism in his voice, the same she used to have. "People change, Peter. Sometimes you need to die a little to really start living." A year after her near-death experience, Sarah was standing before a packed auditorium at the country's largest physics conference. Her lecture, titled "Frontiers of Consciousness, a Dialogue Between Science and Experience," had attracted a diverse audience: scientists, students, and even some people from the spiritualist center her mother attended. "Science teaches us to question, to seek evidence, to doubt our own conclusions," she began. "But it also teaches us that the universe is vaster and more mysterious than our limited capacity for understanding can encompass." As she spoke, her eyes scanned the auditorium. In the front row, her mother and father sat side by side, proud. Regina, with tears in her eyes, held Anthony's hand. Next to them, some of her closest students, those who had accompanied her transformation. "My own journey taught me that we don't need to choose between reason and faith, between science and spirituality. True knowledge is born when we allow ourselves to explore the mysteries of existence with humility and openness." Sarah shared her experience, no longer concerned about what others would think. She talked about the 8 minutes that changed her life, about the lessons she learned on the threshold between life and death. The greatest challenge of modern science is not finding answers, but learning to ask the right questions. And sometimes, the most important questions are those that lead us to question our own certainties. After the lecture, during the question session, a young scientist raised his hand. "Professor, how can we reconcile subjective experiences like yours with the scientific method?" Sarah smiled, remembering when she herself used to ask this type of question. "The scientific method is a powerful tool, but it's not the only form of knowledge. Some truths need to be experienced, not just observed or measured." At the end of the event, while receiving congratulations from those present, Sarah realized how her life had transformed. It wasn't just a change in perspective, but an expansion of consciousness that affected every aspect of her existence. At home that night, sitting on her balcony watching the lights of New York, Sarah reflected on her journey. The apartment, once an aseptic space dedicated only to work, was now full of life. Plants decorated the corners, photos covered the walls, and a small library on spiritual experiences shared space with her physics books. On a Sunday morning, exactly 18 months after her accident, Sarah was again changing a light bulb in her kitchen. This time, however, she was using a proper ladder for the task, and her father was holding the base, ensuring her safety. "I still can't believe you insist on doing this alone," Anthony commented, concerned. Sarah laughed, coming down the ladder after completing the task. "I'm not alone, Dad. You're here with me." The comment carried a deeper meaning than just the current situation, and they both knew it. In the living room, the sounds of the television mingled with Regina's voice, who was preparing Sunday lunch, now a restored tradition in the family. Sarah observed the scene with a smile. Her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. Her academic work now included research on consciousness and transcendental experiences, always maintaining scientific rigor, but with a new openness to mysteries not yet explained. On her desk, a recent photo showed her with a group of people from her mother's spiritualist center, where she occasionally gave lectures on the intersection between science and spirituality. Next to it, her latest article, published in a prestigious scientific journal, addressed the frontiers of human knowledge. "Sarah, come here for a moment," Regina called from the kitchen. Entering the room, Sarah found her mother smiling in front of a decorated cake. "Happy rebirth anniversary," Regina said, emotional. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. 18. Months since she had been on the other side, 18 months since she had chosen a new path. She hugged her mother tightly, feeling her father's presence join the embrace. You know, she said, wiping away tears, those 8 minutes changed everything, but really it was just the beginning. The true transformation happens every day in every choice we make. That afternoon, as family and close friends gathered to celebrate, Sarah watched the movement with a new appreciation for life. Her favorite students, now also friends, were animatedly discussing their research projects with her father. Her mother was talking with some people from the Spiritualist Center about a social project they were developing together. In a moment of quietness, Sarah moved away from the group a bit and went to her balcony. The sun was setting over New York, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the breeze on her face, and smiled as she recognized that familiar feeling of peace she had experienced during her near-death experience. "Thank you," she whispered to the universe, knowing that somewhere, that presence of light that had guided her continued to watch over her journey. Returning to the living room, Sarah looked at the people gathered, her reconstituted family, her true friends, her inspired students. Each of them represented a different aspect of her new life, a life that balanced reason and faith, science and spirituality, knowledge and love. "Professor," one of her students called, "will you tell us once more about those 8 minutes?" Sarah smiled, sitting among them. "I'll tell you about something even more important," she replied. "I'll tell you about all the minutes that came after, and how each one of them is a new opportunity for transformation." And so, as the sun finished setting on the New York horizon, Sarah began to tell her story once more, not just the story of the 8 minutes in the beyond, but the ongoing story of a life transformed by the power of love, forgiveness, and the courage to allow oneself to change.